My name is Zinio Febu, and I am a PhD candidate at North Carolina State University.
My name is Savon Foster. I'm a third-year PhD student in the Sport Management program at Texas A&M University.
Hi, my name is Wayne Black. I'm a third-year doctoral student at the University of Kansas. Today, we will be presenting our paper, They Are United and They Want to Play, a critical discourse analysis of college football player social media activism. Before we start this presentation, I want to give a quick overview. We will start with a background and a discussion over the purpose of our paper. Next, we will move to discussing the literature and theoretical framework that helped to shape this study. And next, we'll move to a conversation around our methodology and our findings. Lastly, we'll conclude with a discussion over the implications and situating our findings within the larger college athletic space. Following the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, college football players became united. In response to the COVID-19 pandemic, college football players let administrators know they wanted to play. Division I Power 5 college football is the most visible sport in college athletics. And despite activism being polarized by contemporaries such as sport leaders, political figures, and larger sport entities, the underlying message was very clear. College football players understood the power of their voices and began to use social media to mobilize and communicate their messages. Drawing on the We Are United, We Want to Play, Big Ten United, and We Are United and We Want to Play collaboration statements, this study examined the discourse that NCAA Power 5 college football players use to advocate for change. We were guided by two research questions. First, what discourse or language did the We Are United, We Want to Play, and Big Ten United letters use to advocate for change? Secondly, how did this discourse support or counter narratives about college athletes and college athletics? College athletes have a long history of activism. During the 50s, college athletes challenged the notion of amateurism and pursued court cases against the NCAA to change policies that would provide more economic equity to college athletes. In the 60s, college athletes mobilized to challenge and remove racial injustices on college campuses, saliently highlighted by the Wyoming Black 14, who demanded to be allowed to wear armbands during their game against Brigham Young University in protest of racial discrimination. Contemporary college athletes have also begun to activate and mobilize within their spaces. These college athletes have advocated for changes in facilities, against negative treatment from coaches, and they've begun to try to unionize to bring more equity and player rights to college athletes. More recently, college athletes have begun to use social media as a method of mobilizing and spreading their message for change. College athletes have large followings, from fans and family to large media companies such as ESPN. Because of the visibility in NCAA Division I sports, some college athletes have started to use their social media platforms to express their views and to become activists. For example, in 2015, the University of Missouri football team took to Twitter to help bring awareness about racial inequities that were taking place on their campus. Researchers have begun to explore athlete activism through social media, particularly within college athletics. And they've noted that social media gives college athletes an ability to reach large audiences very quickly. Conversely, some of the research has explored the limitations to college athletes using social media. And they've noted that institutional policies and team policies can prohibit college athletes from using social media and thus can limit their their activism. This literature has been fundamental. However, it has primarily focused on how far the activism reaches or activism at one institution. Because college athletes play a significant role in college athletics, it is important to understand their experiences and their voice. Examining their language can not only provide an understanding of the college athlete experience, but it can also reveal how college athletes view themselves within college athletics, and reveals inequities and injustice through the eyes and the voice of college players. The college football players who wrote these statements wrote them as a means of creating change and to let administrators know that they were not okay with the status quo. The football players assumed a leadership role in advocating for change, mainly that change that centered on allowing college football to take place. Because of those factors, we utilize the social change model of leadership development as our theoretical framework. In the model, leadership is seen as a dynamic, collaborative process that is situated in individual, group, or societal values. Agents are encouraged to pursue social change that helps the common good. Within the model, leadership is positioned across 7 values. The first 3 values are individual level values: consciousness of self, congruence, and commitment. The next 3 are group level values: collaboration, common purpose, controversy with civility. And the final value is a society level value, which is citizenship. Within the social change model of leadership development, individual, group, and society values are interconnected, interact, and influence one another. Socially responsible leadership and change are not possible without all values working together and being connected. Thus, the model provided an opportunity to see college football players as leaders who work together to create change in college football.
We'll talk about the methods that we used for this study. So CDA or critical discourse analysis, is a method or technique that positions language as a reflection of social practice. And as such, language is tied to historical and sociocultural context, as well as that certain relationships are reproduced, challenged, or left uncontested through the language that we use. So essentially, words need things. There are 3 dimensions of discourse within CDA. The first of which is the object of analysis. So this could either be verbal text, visual text, or a combination of the 2. The second dimension is the process by which the object is delivered and received. So this could be either through spoken word or written text, and then being received either by reading or listening to. And then the third dimension is the socio-historical context that shapes the language that is being used. So in this study, the objects that we studied or analyzed were text or tweets with about 200 characters or less, and they were shared on the app Twitter, or on the mobile platform Twitter, and statements that were published to the online platform, the Players Tribune. And these texts were written by players and read by us as researchers and consumers. And the context that shaped these texts and the language that they use in these texts were the COVID-19 pandemic, and of course, the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor. So we collected 2 types of data, the first of which was tweets that used either the We Are United, Big Ten United, and We Want to Play hashtags. We pulled about 500 tweets from football players or football players that used one or more of these hashtags in their Twitter discourse. And we wanted to see who was engaging with it and how they were engaging with the different hashtags. And then we turned our attention to the statements or the graphics that were released by these social media campaigns. So there was a graphic that was released by the We Are United and We Want to Play platforms. They came together and created one graphic. And then there were two statements that were shared on the Players Tribune by We Are United and Big Ten United. So we looked at those three statements. So to analyze these statements, we went through 3 rounds of coding. In the first round, we coded the statements individually and identified elements of the social change model of leadership. And this can be understood as our textual analysis, really looking at what the text was saying. Then we coded for processing analysis individually, wherein we sought to interpret the language, why they may have chosen to use certain words, what the meaning behind what they were saying was. And then finally, following each round of coding, we came together to discuss our coding schemes, the sociocultural and historical implications that were shaping the language that was being used, and also to come to a consensus around the themes that we selected. So our findings, we have 2 sets of findings. One set in the context of the social change model of leadership, and the second set were a few thematic findings that we found across all 3 of the statements. So using the social change model of leadership, looking at individual values, under consciousness of self, we felt that the authors of the statements displayed a clear awareness of who they were and what they wanted to accomplish with writing these statements. So for example, the We Are United statement began many of their sentences with the word because at the beginning, seemingly affirming that they were doing this because this is who we are, because this is what we value and this is what is important to us. In addition to this, many of the statements called for social justice and racial justice, both in college sports and in society as a whole. So there was an awareness of who they were and what they wanted, which led to them using social justice-oriented language. In regards to congruence, we felt that the authors of the statements displayed a congruence or consistency through repetition of certain statements, and including language that signaled that this was these were collective projects. It wasn't just a couple athletes that came together and decided to speak on behalf of every athlete across America, but it was a collective effort by multiple athletes at multiple institutions. So a variety of perspectives were included in the project. And then under commitment, the authors of the statements displayed a commitment to their goals using language like calling for change to happen now, calling the NCAA and schools to tackle racial justice, social justice, using those terms word for word, and acknowledging that may have been differing values, but coming together to decide these are what we want to happen. These are our list of demands. This is what we want, what kind of change we want to happen in our institutions in the NCAA. So there was a clear commitment to the goals that they were setting forth in these statements. In regards to group values, we felt that there was a lot of collaboration that was taking place in order to create these statements. So athletes across institutions came together to write them. The We Are United and We Want to Play statement was a collaboration between 2 campaigns, so there was some clear collaboration there. Under common purpose, each of the statements had a list of demands. Some were longer than others, but they were intact in all 3 of the statements. And as researchers, we agreed that many of them read like labor union demands, which is ironic because our student athletes are not considered employees, they're considered amateurs, right? So it was ironic, but that was a very clear purpose throughout each of the statements. And then under controversy with civility, we inferred that in writing these statements, the athletes probably had many conversations where they worked through differences to come to common ground as far as what demands or what things they wanted the letter to accomplish, what things they wanted to say, this is what we need in order to continue. And although the authors of the statements were from revenue generating sports, namely football, the statements were evoking for change across all institutions, across the board, for all athletes, regardless of sport, and some even division level. And finally, under societal values, with citizenship, the language in these statements were clearly conveying a sense of social responsibility and ownership, using words like we and our to describe issues that were plaguing the Black community and the student athlete community. So they displayed a sense of ownership and responsibility to those communities, as well as having representation from institutions across the board, Power 5 institutions, calling for change across all divisions, and advocating for rights for all student athletes, not just Power 5 football players. So our second set of findings, our thematic findings, we found three major emergent themes. The first of which was critique of structures. There was a lot of strongly worded language used to describe the NCAA and institutions' responses to COVID and racial justice. So fall short, immoral rules, failed us. The authors were critical of the NCAA and sports leaders for calling for sports participation during the pandemic. There was also critique of the NCAA's hypercritical actions towards social justice and equity. One of the statements in particular named exploitation in college sports and said that it goes against what the Black Lives Matter movement stood for, which the NCAA was conveniently trying to align itself with during this time while all of this was happening. So they were calling the NCAA and institutions out and critiquing the different structures they were expected to operate in. Additionally, there was language that called for both temporary change, but also changes that were exclusive to football or Power 5 conferences. So basically, some of the statements were asking for changes in order to play safely in a COVID pandemic world. And of course, once the pandemic begins to subside, these changes are irrelevant or they're not as pressing. So they're temporary. There were also requests for more structure and transparency, giving students the option to opt out without losing their eligibility, and a call for detailed safety protocols related to playing during a pandemic. So these are more so temporary changes that wouldn't really be applicable once this pandemic is no longer a pressing concern. And they were more so asking for these changes to be implemented for football players or Power 5 student athletes at Power 5 conferences. And then finally, some of the language called for disruptive action or inclusivity of all athletes across conferences, across sports. So there were things like calling for revenue sharing for student athletes, calling for the creation of racial justice task forces, civic engagement task forces, calling for an end to these over-the-top coaches' salaries so that student athletes, so that there would be more equity across student athletes who are unpaid and these coaches who are making millions and millions of dollars off of their labor. So these changes were more so disruptive in that they called for some major changes to the way that the NCAA and institutions have set up college sports. So we felt that these were more disruptive to the system.
Based off of our findings, these are some of the key points we would like to discuss. The first is that athletes understanding they're actively engaging within their communities, whether it's their sporting communities, their university communities, or the broader societal communities that athletes have aligned themselves with before, during, or after their time within their sport. This awareness, coupled with the amplified positions on campus, given the nature of college sport, has driven many athletes to work against the shut up and dribble narrative that's been unfairly attached to them. While this narrative is somewhat recent, the history of athletes engaging in activism and finding ways to create change in their communities and on their campuses is a long-standing tradition that's been happening since the 1950s. Athletes are aware of their placement within the commercial enterprise of intercollegiate athletics. Athletes understand how much money is being generated from their outputs, so they're positioning and treating themselves as key stakeholders. And because of this, they're trying to move the needle forward when it comes to creating a more socially just and equitable sporting environment. Because of this, some of the implications that have come from their statements and athletes positioning themselves as such, that many players across programs have spoken out about their experiences, which has led to a ripple effect, which has been dismantling problematic cultures within intercollegiate sport. As well as athletes, they've continued to move past and dismantle negative stereotypes and narratives attached to them. Some of the new counter narratives that have come from these statements and athletes speaking out is that they are stakeholders within intercollegiate sport. They are leaders within their communities, within their campuses, and within their respective sports, and that athletes are people beyond their role in sport. And it's important to consider all of these counter narratives as the experiences and voices of athletes. Because of this, the NCAA and athletic departments must be open to inviting athletes to the table with goals to create change. Because athletes are key and major stakeholders, it will be nearly impossible to create true structural change if athletes are not included within these developments. To conclude, we have 3 key points that we would like to note. The first is that the assumption that athletes will remain impartial and silent is no longer realistic, although history has shown us that athletes have been outspoken, they've been vocal, they've been powerful elements within this driving force to create change. This assumption is no longer realistic. Scholars should continue to engage with college athletes to understand their voices and their experiences with activism, as well as seeking to understand their experiences in general as athletes, to dig into those subtle nuances, whether it's by sport, by institution, by any demographic identifiers. It's important to continue engaging with and understanding these elements. And then finally, athletic departments need to continue to take actionable steps to center athletes as intercollegiate sport continues to grow and continues to develop. We would like to thank you all for being a part of our presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us on Twitter. As you see, our Twitter names are listed. We look forward to hearing from you and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.